Before we begin, I want to reassure you that this is not a clickbait video. This video will reveal not only how the Isdal woman died, but also if her death was a murder or suicide. But for the answer to make any sense, we have to start at the beginning. It was Sunday morning on the 29th of November 1970, and a professor was enjoying the remainder of his weekend with his two young daughters on a trek through the beautiful Isdal Valley in Norway. The literal translation of Isdal Valley is Ice Valley, but following an inexplicable string of suicides that occurred there in the Middle Ages, locals came to know it by a more sinister name, Death Valley. And the valley's dark reputation was only enhanced when a number of hikers fell to their deaths there in the 1960s. When they paused to take in the valley's resplendent beauty, they were greeted by a stunning vista of pine trees and majestic snow-capped mountains mirrored in the pristine lake that ran through its centre. But as they continued forwards, the atmosphere changed. An eerie silence fell among the young family as the crisp, fresh autumn air was suddenly filled with the pungent smell of something burnt. That was when they saw something that looked out of place. It was a charred branch poking out among the rocks of the trail. Curiosity got the better of them, but as they approached it, they realized this was no branch. It was the blackened hand of a corpse reaching desperately to the sky. The face was burned beyond recognition, the lips of which had melted away, giving its features the ghoulish illusion of being frozen in a grimace of pain. The father shielded his daughters from the horrific scene before them, and they hurried back to Bergen to report what they had found to the police. This would mark the start of one of the most mysterious and enigmatic cold cases in history. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home of the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. As I said at the start, this video will explain how the Isdal woman died, as well as reviewing the key theories and evidence related to the case. This has taken a lot of research, so please remember to leave a comment, like, and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. And with that being said, let's begin. It's unknown what the Bergen police expected to find at the scene, but it's safe to say that nothing could have prepared them for the inexplicable nature of what they uncovered that day. They quickly established that the corpse was female, but as they continued to investigate the scene, they realized this was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The front of the woman had been severely burned. The fire was so intense that it rendered her face unrecognizable. Her forearms were raised and her hands were clenched into fists in what is known as the boxer position, which is typical of bodies exposed to extreme heat. But strangely, the fire only burned the front of her body. Her back was untouched. There was nothing at the scene to indicate an obvious heat source, no campfire, no wood, and no accelerant to account for the intensity of the fire. There were no signs of charring or burn marks on the ground either. It looked like the woman had spontaneously caught fire, but the fire only burnt her front. Things got even stranger when the police looked for clues to her identity. They found a passport holder and burned paper beside it, which officers deduced had been a passport. It looked like the passport had been burned intentionally. A burned out box of matches explained how the passport was burned, but this didn't account for the fire that consumed the body. On a stone to the right of the body was the remains of a green checkered woolen scarf, but its tag had been removed. And under the body they found a fur hat, which, like the scarf, had its tag removed. Next to the body they found 2 white plastic bottles filled with water, but like the scarf and hat, any identifying features had been removed. It is clear that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal her identity. I want to take a moment to talk about the hat, as this forms the basis for some of the theories surrounding the nature of the Isdal woman's death. When the hat was sent away for testing, they found traces of petrol on it, and by traces, we're talking about no more than 1 or 2 drops of petrol. The trace amounts of petrol led detectives to conclude that petrol had been the accelerant that fueled the fire. There are several problems with this theory, but I'll cover this later in the episode. They also found a pair of rubber boots and jewellery, which included an earring, a ring, and a watch. They were organised in a way that detectives would describe as ceremonial. But by far the most disturbing and tragic piece of evidence was the presence of 12 sleeping pills next to the body. With nothing to identify the dead woman, she became known as the Isdal Woman. As well as the mystery surrounding her identity, the police were still unsure as to the nature of her death. The question remained, was it self-inflicted or murder? Her body was sent away for autopsy, and her fingerprints were taken in the hopes of answering at least one of these questions. With no leads to go on, the police launched a public appeal for information, asking if anyone had seen a woman with brown eyes, a round face, and small ears. She was estimated to be between the ages of 25 to 40 and around 5'4" tall, with long brownish black hair that she wore in a ponytail that was tied with a blue and white print ribbon. It wasn't much to go on, but 3 days later, on the 2nd of December 1970, detectives made a discovery that blew the case wide open. An attendant at the local train station learned about the investigation and called the police to tell them about 2 suspicious pieces of luggage that had been left unattended for over a week. In one of the suitcases, a pair of sunglasses were found, with a partial fingerprint on them. It matched the fingerprints taken from the Isdal woman. There was no doubt about it. They were in possession of the Isdal woman's luggage. There was a tangible buzz of excitement in the air as investigating officers examined the contents of the suitcase, confident of finding that vital piece of information that would identify her. But as they continued to look through the cases, their enthusiasm slowly gave way to confusion. The clothes in the suitcases had all identifying labels removed. Even the hairbrushes and makeup products had their brand labels rubbed off. They found a tube of prescribed eczema cream, which ordinarily would have shown the name of the doctor and patient. But as with the clothes and makeup, this information had been scraped off. The only objects not to have a label removed was a matchbox from an erotic lingerie store in Germany. Considering how meticulously she had removed the identifying information from all the other items, it was a strange and uncharacteristic oversight. But what they found next raised even more questions. In the lining of one of the suitcases, police discovered 5 100 Deutschmark notes. Among other items were 135 Norwegian kroner, as well as Belgian and Swiss coins. She clearly travelled, but suspicions about the nature of her travel were raised when they found several wigs and a pair of clean lensed glasses. It appeared that in addition to concealing her identity, she was actively attempting to regularly change it. And that was when they found the notepad. They were initially hopeful that it would contain some clue as to who she was, but when they opened it, they found an enigmatic code of letters and numbers. It was sent away to a code-breaking specialist, but even if the code couldn't be cracked, they now had a copy of her handwriting. And as the case developed, this proved to be an invaluable resource. Suddenly, one of the officers cried out, and from one of the suitcases, he pulled out a plastic carrier bag. It was from Oskar Rødtvedt's footwear store in Stavanger. It would prove to be the most significant lead so far, but it would take investigating officers down a rabbit hole of riddles, conspiracies, and espionage. As soon as the officers asked the store's 22-year-old son, Rolf Rødtvedt, about the woman, he immediately remembered selling a pair of boots to what he described as a well-dressed, nice-looking woman with dark hair. One of the reasons he remembered her so well was because of several distinct characteristics. She was on the shorter side, at least by Norwegian standards, at around 1.70 m or 5'5", with dark brown hair and brown eyes. Her skin was more of a golden shade than people in the area. She had a notable gap in her top 2 front teeth, and she smelled strongly of a perfume he'd never smelled before. He would later say it most closely resembled garlic. The most significant clue was the pair of boots that she bought. Rolf noticed that she took an incredibly long time in deciding which pair to buy, and asked a lot of questions in what he described as poor English. But the boots she bought were the same boots as those found next to the body of the Isdal Woman. It was clear that she and the Isdal Woman were the same person. Armed with a more detailed description of the Isdal Woman, the police inquired at local businesses, and they received another lead almost immediately. A receptionist at Hotel San Svitun, just down the road from the shoe store, confirmed a foreign, dark-haired woman with a gap in her top 2 front teeth, who smelled strongly of a strange perfume, had stayed there. She then showed them the guest book and explained that all foreign visitors had to check in with their name, address, passport number, and signature. She pointed to the name of the woman in question. Her name was Fenella Lork from Belgium. And later, when handwriting experts concluded that the Isdal Woman's handwriting matched Fenella Lork's, it gave detectives the confirmation they needed that Fenella Lork and the Isdal Woman were one and the same. Lork must have travelled from Stavanger to Bergen and checked in at a hotel there before her life ended in the Isdal Valley. Now with a name, address, passport number, and physical description, identifying the Isdal Woman should have been easy. There was just one problem. Fenella Lorque didn't exist. Over the next few days, detectives made a series of shocking discoveries. Several hotels around Norway reported that a woman matching the description of the Isdal Woman had stayed there, and along with the help of handwriting experts, detectives were able to use the handwritten hotel check-in forms to confirm it was her. It was found that the Isdal Woman had stayed in Oslo, Trondheim, Stavanger, and Bergen in the months before her death. But each time, she used a different name. The only thing that stated the same thing was her alleged origin, Belgium. In total, she appeared to have used 8 passports, all Belgian. But following inquiries with the Belgian authorities, it was established that no one existed with the names she had given, nor did the addresses she provided exist. In addition to her travels around Norway, it was also found that in the months between April and October that year, she had been in Switzerland and stayed in 2 different hotels in Paris under the name Vera Schloscheneck. It turned out she made quite the impression on those she met on her travels, including one 21-year-old waitress at the Hotel Neptune. She was working in the hotel one evening when she spotted the Isdal Woman dining alone. This was particularly uncommon in the 1970s, but she couldn't help being impressed with the sophisticated elegance and self-assuredness the lone woman displayed. She must have stared a moment too long, because the Isdal Woman, sensing the presence of the waitress, turned and looked straight at her. But rather than being annoyed at her for staring, she gave her a knowing wink and then returned to her meal. The waitress later remarked to a colleague that she hoped she could replicate the Isdal Woman's style someday. One receptionist was struck by the Isdal Woman's intelligence, noting how she filled out the foreign person form without any trouble, despite the form being in Norwegian. Every witness the police interviewed remarked on how well dressed and cultured the Isdal Woman was. She knew her wine, she smoked exotic cigarettes, not available in Norway at the time, and despite her reserved nature, she exuded an undeniable aura. The witness statements painted a picture of a beautiful, intelligent, and charismatic young woman. But this just made the nature of her death all the more mysterious. But in addition to her elegance, she exhibited some unusual quirks, which point to something else going on beneath the surface of her carefully refined exterior. On more than one occasion, when being offered a room, the Isdal Woman would be unhappy with what she was shown and ask for a different room. There was one instance a hotel manager reported she changed rooms 3 times during her stay. A head receptionist at one hotel noticed that she left the hotel every day she was there, and it was reported that whenever she left her room, she placed a chair in the hallway and then carried it back into the room when she returns. One morning, the Isdal Woman ordered coffee and breakfast to her room, but when the maid knocked on the door to deliver the order, she was too frightened to open it. Maid started to notice other strange behaviours, such as insisting on making her own bed, and moving the room tables into the closet. Perhaps this could be explained by the Isdal woman trying to make more space in the room, but it doesn't explain why she would leave the door outside the room when she was away, or her sudden paranoia and fear of opening the door to receive the breakfast order she had made just 20 minutes earlier. Finally, eyewitnesses reported seeing the Isdal woman with an unknown man on several occasions in the days leading up to her death. It was reported that on one occasion, the Isdal woman and an unknown man dined together in the hotel's dining room. By all accounts, it was an awkward dinner, as neither said a word during the entirety of the meal. There's another report of a hotel maid entering her room and seeing the Isdal woman along with a man who was sat in a chair facing her. This encounter was just as frosty as the one reported at lunch, and it appeared that the two had been sat in silence for some time. The man has never been identified, and of all the reported sightings, only one witness gave a description of the man, who they described as being older. This is particularly unhelpful, as it makes it impossible to know if it was the same man she was spending time with, or a series of different men. On the 23rd of November, 1970, the Isdal woman checked out the hotel Horde Heyman. She paid her bill in cash and asked for a taxi. It was the last time she was seen alive. With so many unanswered questions, from who she was to how she died, the case appeared to be a long way from being solved. But on the 21st of December, 1970, the lead detective of the case held a press conference and announced that her death was a suicide. What makes this all the more remarkable is that the police went public with this conclusion before they'd received the results of an autopsy. If they were hoping the press conference would end conjecture about the Isdal woman, it ended up having the opposite effect. A public, still without answers, began to suspect a cover-up. And decades later, when it was revealed that the police had worked with the Norwegian Secret Service as part of their investigation, theories about the Isdal woman being a spy intensified. Although to say the Norwegian Secret Service were working with the Bergen police is generous. In recent years, those involved in the case have stated that they felt their investigations were slowed down or even prevented by higher authorities. One example of this is when Bergen investigators booked trips to Switzerland and France to investigate the Isdal woman's stay at the hotels there, but the Norwegian Secret Service prevented their travel. If the Norwegian Secret Service were preventing the Bergen police from travelling to France and Switzerland, it's due to one of two reasons. The Norwegian Secret Service was certain she was not a spy, and therefore didn't want to risk diplomatic ties with an unnecessary investigation on foreign soil. The alternative is that they had reason to believe she was a spy, and were concerned about the implications of a foreign agent operating and potentially being murdered on Norwegian soil. The second half of this episode will review some of the key theories related to this case, including that of the Isdal woman being a spy, and finally, my own theory on how she died. So now feels like a good time to summarise the case so far. The police have the burned corpse of an unidentified woman who died in mysterious circumstances in the remote region of Isdal Valley. 2 suitcases belonging to her were found at Bergen train station and found to contain wigs, glasses, eczema cream, and a notepad with a ciphered note. The identified names and markings were removed from nearly all her belongings, and finally, it was discovered that she'd been travelling through Norway and Europe using a number of false identities. The Isdal woman's unusual behaviour and the extent she went to cover up her identity led many to believe she was a spy, or at least involved in some form of espionage. This theory gained significant traction less than 3 years later, in the summer of 1973, when a waiter was assassinated in broad daylight by Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. He was killed in a tragic case of mistaken identity, but it proved that Secret Service agents were operating in Norway, and more worryingly, they were prepared to kill a suspected target. It made the possibility that the Isdal woman was a spy killed by a rival agent all the more real. This was all happening in the context of the Cold War, and while it's now certain spies were operating in Norway at the time, particularly as Norway were working on their own state-of-the-art missile defence system, was the Isdal woman one of them? When people theorise that the Isdal woman was a spy, they point to 4 key pieces of evidence. The first is a cryptic code found in her suitcase. The second is the wigs and non-prescription glasses found in her luggage. The third are the 8 fake passports she used when travelling, and the fourth was her propensity to remove all identifying marks from her belongings. The code in her notebook was broken fairly quickly, and it didn't contain anything to suggest she was a spy, and the code itself was fairly basic. In fact, it was little more than a shorthand record of places she had visited. For example, 022-028-P are dates she was in Paris. Using an O as code for October, P for Paris, and the numbers 22 to signify the dates is certainly not the sort of code a secret agent would use to communicate their movements. So while spies finding her notepad wasn't a concern for her, she was certainly paranoid about someone knowing where she had been. The wigs and glasses are often cited as evidence the Isdal woman was trying to conceal her identity. But there is one glaring problem with this. There is no evidence to suggest she ever wore the wigs or glasses, or made any attempt to change her appearance. All the witness statements in all the hotels she stayed at described her in the same way. She has the same colour hair, the same accent, the same style of dress, the same colour eyes. She even smelled the same. It would have been different if her appearance was different each time, and the only way investigators tracked her movements was through her handwriting, but the opposite happened. She was tracked precisely because she made no effort to change her appearance. The reported sightings of her were then verified by handwriting experts when reviewing the guest check-in logs. It's inconceivable that a spy would carry a suitcase full of disguises and never use them. This brings us to the question of her 8 passports. It's frequently stated that for her to have so many passports, she must have been involved in some sort of clandestine activity, whereas others argue it would be unusual for a spy to be given 8 different passports to travel to 3 different countries. Typically, when a spy is given an alias, a lot of time is spent developing that alias. So it seems a little excessive for a spy to be given a different alias for each hotel they check into. Of course, the question remains, if she wasn't a spy, how did she acquire 8 passports? This whole debate is framed by the assumption she actually had 8 passports. When her body was found, the police only found 1 passport next to her body. So if she had 8 passports, where are the other 7? Surely she'd have burned all 8 together. Why burn just 1 passport? And why have investigators only ever found 1 passport? The answer could be that she only ever had 1 passport. There are 2 details that support this. The first is that the passport she used was always a Belgian passport. The second is that she didn't need to change her appearance to look like the photo in the passport. So it's reasonable to assume the passport had the same photo of her each time she checked in. This leaves 2 possibilities. The first is that the Isdal Woman acquired 8 passports, all Belgian, and put the same photo of her in each one, just so she could have a slightly different address each time. The second is that she had 1 passport, most likely her original one, and simply doctored the text. It's difficult, but not impossible, if the person in question is resourceful, creative, and intelligent. And if there's one thing we know about the Isdal Woman, is that she was a woman of considerable intelligence and resourcefulness. It would be different if she had multiple passports from different countries and altered her appearance each time she used them, but this simply wasn't the case. The final piece of evidence people point to when theorizing she was a spy is the removal of the identifying marks from her belongings. This alone doesn't point to her being a spy, and it's important to remember that the clue that led police to uncovering her movements was the shoe bag found in her suitcase. For someone who meticulously removed all identifying labels from her clothes, makeup and prescriptions, it's a remarkable oversight for a professional spy to make. The code in her notebook was certainly not the type employed by intelligence services, but the fact she felt the need to use a code demonstrates her paranoia about someone else seeing where she had been. And when combined with the wig and glasses that were never used, her behaviour starts to appear too paranoid and too erratic for that of a spy. There are other aspects of her behaviour which suggest the mindset of someone suffering from paranoia rather than being a spy, such as moving so frequently from hotel to hotel, and then, when in the hotel, insisting on her room being changed multiple times. This is the kind of behaviour that would make her very memorable. It's the antithesis of the discretion required for spycraft. Then there's a maid's account of the Isdal Woman ordering breakfast to her room, but then being too afraid to answer the door when the food arrived no more than 20 minutes later. What could have changed in such a short period of time? It all points to someone experiencing the sudden onset of a psychotic episode, most likely due to an underlying condition such as schizophrenia. So if she wasn't a spy, who was she? In 2016, an analysis of her teeth indicated she was born in southern Germany around 1930. And in 2019, DNA taken from tissue collected at her autopsy showed that her mother was of Southeast European or Southwest Asian descent. A recent analysis of her handwriting concluded that she was most likely raised in a French-speaking country, either France, Switzerland, or Belgium. This conclusion was based on two factors. She doubled the cross stroke over the lowercase t's on her hotel check-in forms, and she underlined her signature, starting from the first initial, as was customary among French-speaking Europeans. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us much more than we already knew, but it does help to clarify a few things. Namely, that her physical characteristics, her dark eyes, hair, and golden skin were most likely inherited from her mother, and that the reason she typically used fictional Belgian addresses is because this is the country she was raised, and therefore most comfortable with. After all, the most believable lies often start with a grain of truth. When the results of the autopsy came back on the 2nd of January 1971, there were more questions than answers. It was found that the Isdal Woman had taken up to 80 Fenamel brand sleeping pills in around 2 to 3 bunches. The timing of the first dose was estimated to be a few hours before her death. It would take around 2 hours to walk from Bergen to where her body was found, so it's safe to assume she had taken these before she reached the Isdal Valley. Yet, despite the fatal dose of sleeping pills, it wasn't the pills that killed her. In fact, at the time of her death, only the first dose of sleeping pills had passed into her blood. The concentration in her blood was 4.5 milligrams per 100 milliliters, which is about half the concentration required to lose consciousness. This means the Isdal Woman would have been drowsy, but not unconscious. It was found that her cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning from the fire that burnt her body. There was a significant quantity of soot particles found in her respiratory tract, meaning she was burned alive. From here, the nature of her death became even more perplexing. The sleeping pills were a brand sold in England, and as there's no record of her visit in England, how did she get hold of them? And as the number of pills she had taken was fatal, why would she then decide to set fire to herself? The cause of the fire was another mystery, as there were no clear signs of an accelerant. As mentioned earlier in the episode, trace amounts of petrol was found on her hat, but nowhere else, not even on her skin. It was also discovered she had a bruise on the right side of her neck, either from being struck or a fall. Now, as promised, I have a theory which explains all of this, and the evidence to support it. But for it to make sense, we need to discuss some of the other theories first. The theory she was murdered goes something like this. She was forced to take a lethal amount of sleeping pills by a person or persons unknown, and then set fire to. Of course, if she was murdered, who would want her dead? The prevailing theory is it was somehow related to her being a spy, but as covered earlier, the evidence and her reported behaviour doesn't support this. Another theory is that she was a sex worker, and that she used the aliases to hide her true identity. The problem with this is that surely one alias would have been enough. 8 passports is excessive. In fact, the only evidence to support the theory she was a sex worker is that she was seen in the company of a man on a handful of occasions. And it's worth noting that on each occasion, the interactions were recorded as frosty at best. Not the kind of interaction you'd expect between a sex worker and a prospective client. One of the questions relating to this theory is how she had the money to travel and stay in hotels. This question assumes that she had no money or savings to travel Europe to begin with. If this case was called the Isdal Man, and we had the exact same evidence, you can be certain that no one would be saying, why was he seen with women? How does he afford to travel? He must be a sex worker. It's slightly off topic, but it reflects the nature of assumptions and prejudice that can typify cases of missing women versus those of missing men. But along with motive, the biggest problem with the theory of her being murdered are the details leading up to her death. The coroner's report states that she'd been taking the sleeping pill in batches over several hours before the mysterious fire which ultimately caused her death. If a would-be killer or assassin was somehow forcing her to take the sleeping pills, would they really take the risk of spending hours with her and watch as she slowly overdosed, only to eventually set fire to her at some point after reaching the Isdal Valley? Why would someone go to all the trouble of making her murder look like a suicide by forcing her to overdose on sleeping pills, only to make it look like a murder by setting fire to her? In other words, a murder that looks like a suicide that looks like a murder. It doesn't make sense. So, if it wasn't a murder, it must have been a suicide, right? Well, not exactly. The suicide theory suggests that after taking the sleeping pills, she then set herself on fire. Apart from the obvious question of why she would choose such an agonizing death rather than wait for the sleeping pills to take effect, there's a bigger question of the accelerant used for the fire. It's generally thought that petrol was the accelerant due to trace amounts of it being found on the hat under her body, but the problem with this is that no petrol canisters were found. Petrol wasn't found anywhere else on the scene, nor was it found on any other item of clothing or on her body. The nature of the fire is also strange, as it was localized to the front of her body. Her back was untouched. There was no charring on the ground or the surrounding areas, which means if petrol was the accelerant, she'd have had to somehow carefully painted it on herself, without spilling it anywhere, whilst also disposing of the canister. The same issue was encountered with the theory of a second person being responsible for pouring petrol on her. The nature of the fire is too neat and too localized to have been the result of someone pouring petrol over the body. And finally, there are the sleeping pills. The brand used, Fenamel, was a brand readily available in Norway, yet the pills she used were exclusively sold in England, a country that by all accounts she had never visited. Why didn't she just buy sleeping pills in Norway instead of somehow acquiring the same brand of pills from a completely different country? So if it wasn't murder and it wasn't suicide, that means her death was accidental. While it was her intention to take her own life, she didn't intend on dying the way she did. In fact, the evidence suggests someone who meticulously planned how they would die, but something went wrong. So here is a timeline of what happened, leading to her death. By the time she checked out her hotel, she'd already made the decision to take her own life. This wasn't an impulsive decision, it was calculated. She had nearly 100 sleeping pills, but rather than take them in one go, she spaced them out over several hours, as reported in her autopsy. This shows that she intentionally spaced out the dose, so she would be able to get to where she was going before the pills took full effect. It's not a coincidence her planned destination was Isdal Valley, the same valley known for suicides centuries before. It's likely that a woman as well-travelled, intelligent and cultured as she was would have known about the lore of the Isdal Valley and possibly learned of the significance of ending one's life there. By the time she reached Isdal Valley, she had consumed 80 pills. She would have been drowsy, but not unconscious, as reflected by the concentrations of 4.5 milligrams per 100 milliliters of sleeping pills in her bloods. She sat down and pulled out the last 12 sleeping pills, but before ingesting them, she had one final thing to do. She had to burn her passport, thereby concealing her identity for all time. She removed the matchbox found at the scene and set fire to the passport. It was around this time she either dropped the match or an ember from the burning passport fell onto her clothing, setting her on fire. The fire took hold far quicker than she expected, and she quickly stood up to pat out the flames. She would have instinctively leant backwards away from the flames, but with 80 sleeping pills now coursing through her system, she inevitably lost balance and fell backwards and hit the ground. Her neck landed on a nearby rock, rendering her unconscious and helpless to prevent the fire consuming her as she lay there. Therefore, while she intended on killing herself, she hadn't planned on going like that. But there are 3 questions that need answering for this theory to work. What was the accelerant? How did she get nearly 100 sleeping pills from England? And why would she want to kill herself? The answer to the accelerant can be found in her suitcases found at Bergen train station. Among the wigs and other items was a tube of eczema cream. But this wasn't any eczema cream. It was a prescription strength emollient by the name of Betnevat. And we know she'd been using this cream while in Norway. Firstly, because a tube of cream was manufactured and sold in Norway, as we can see on its label, and secondly, the cream had clearly been used. One of the many properties of Betnevat is that it's extremely flammable. In fact, it's so flammable that it comes with a warning to keep away from cigarettes or open flames during and after application, the sort of flame a match or burning passport would create. The second property of Betnevat is that due to it being so oily, it's easily absorbed into clothes, but incredibly difficult to remove, even after washing. So the Isdal Woman was applying an extremely flammable cream to her body, which in turn was being absorbed by her clothes. Even after washing, her clothes still had the cream on them, and each time she reapplied the cream to her body, her clothes absorbed more and more of it, becoming more and more combustible. All it would have taken would be for her to drop the match or an ember from the passport to land on her clothes, and she'd have gone up in flames. But the only part of her that would have burned would have been the area she applied the cream, namely the front of her body and face. This is a phenomena known as the wick effect, where a body, after being ignited by an external source, is consumed by fire with its own body fat acting as fuel, and clothing acting as a wick, similar to how a candle burns. This process results in localized burning of the body, with minimal damage to the surrounding areas, and leaves no trace of the accelerant once it's been burned away. The exact nature of the fire that killed the Isdal Woman. To give an indication of just how flammable eczema creams are, in 2020, the British government released a public health warning about the flammable nature of eczema creams, following the deaths of 50 people who died in fires directly linked to their use of eczema creams. And only a few months before this episode was released, an 89-year-old man tragically died in a fire after driving his clothes on a heater in his home. There was no open flame, but the heat alone was enough to ignite the eczema cream his clothes had absorbed. The second question is how she acquired the sleeping pills from England. A clue can be found in her reported meetings with men. Unfortunately, there is little in the way of descriptions of the men she was seen with, but the one consistent feature is that the meetings appeared uncomfortable. This isn't what you would expect from a meeting between a sex worker and a client, but it would be more in keeping with her meeting with someone for a darker reason. The sleeping pills were a brand readily available in Norway. She could have acquired them from any of the nearby pharmacies, but the quantity she wanted would have raised questions. So she met with someone she trusted, a friend or family member, and asked them to acquire the pills for her. The conversation would have been awkward and uncomfortable, as reported by the witnesses of these interactions. Which brings us to the final question. Why did the Isdal woman want to end her own life? The clues are in the inconsistencies of her behaviour. In the suitcases, all the tags were removed from her clothes, but she didn't dispose of the shoe bag, which allowed the police to track her movements in the year leading up to her death. There's a maid's account of the Isdal woman ordering room service and 20 minutes later being too afraid to open the door. Then there's the account of the waitress who stayed at the Isdal woman a moment too long. But rather than being annoyed or upset, the Isdal woman simply turned and gave her a friendly wink. We have the behaviour of someone who is incredibly paranoid, but not all the time. Paranoid enough to scratch off her tags and prescription details, but not paranoid enough to dispose of a shopping bag. Too paranoid to open the door to room service, but relaxed enough to order it in the first place, and to give a knowing wink to someone she knew was staring at her. It suggests the paranoia and psychosis that came and went. And I think in her moments of clarity, she would have seen this, and possibly noticed it was getting worse. The treatment of mental health conditions in the 1970s was poor at best, and still not fully understood. The feeling she was slowly losing her mind must have been terrifying for her. The steps she had taken leading up to her death, the acquisition of pills from abroad, the measured dose in which she consumed them, her choice of location to end her life, it all suggests somebody who thought long and hard about their decision and concluded that they would rather end it all than continue their descent into psychosis. She was laid to rest in February 1971 in a zinc coffin that wouldn't disintegrate in case she ever needed to be exhumed. The only people present were the detectives investigating her case. An unknown woman, surrounded by strangers, buried in a strange land. It was a sad conclusion to Norway's most famous cold case. When the mystique and intrigue are stripped away, we're left with a set of circumstances that led to the tragic death of a beautiful and intelligent young woman who was most likely suffering some form of undiagnosed mental illness and never received the help she so desperately needed. We can only hope that in death she found the peace that evaded her in life. That's all from Paranormal FM. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And be sure to join me next time.